Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'm back again for another episode. And I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me Skip Rhudy. Skip, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor, and I hope we'll have some fun talking about writing and literature.
So, you're from Port Aransas, or what I would just call Port A. And what's one of the things that has fascinated me, I grew up in Houston, is the different parts of the Texas Gulf Coast. Obviously, Galveston and sort of north to Beaumont is one, at least in my mind. Then we've got sort of that mid part, Matagorda Bay down to Port Aransas, and then Padre Island, all the way down to the coast. And there, one might think it's one big seashore, but it's really not. And I was really interested to sort of hear the culture of Port Aransas from your perspective, having moved there as nearly a teenager. Can maybe tell us about what was it like to grow up in a leisure place like Port Aransas, and equally importantly, what was it like to live there full time?
That's a really interesting question, and it was, I would say, very much a place where contrasts were very stark depending on what time of year it was. So when we moved there, the sign for coming into town is Port Aransas, population 1,200. Now, I don't know what that sign says today, but certainly the number of people on the island every day is just it's just blossomed. And there's just a tremendous amount of activity there every day during the week now. At the time when I moved there, things were really intense, and a lot of people were visiting during fishing tournaments and during the holidays and even just during the regular summer holidays. But then once you got to September, October, and winter set in, it was absolutely desolate. And in fact, I try to allude to that a little bit in certain parts of this novel because while there's plenty of action when things are hopping in Port Aransas, it can be an almost depressing experience at that time during the winter when it was desolate, really is the word I'd use.
Was the island access via a ferry, or was there a bridge by the time you moved there?
It was all ferry, but you could also come in through Corpus. But if you came in through Aransas Pass, which I did every day when I was in school through high school, because we went to Aransas Pass High School, we crossed the ferry every day. But you could also get to the island, of course, at that time through Corpus Christi and the what was called the Island Road, but it's now Highway 361.
There is, no, I guess was is the proper verb, a famous Texas high school football coach who grew up in Port Aransas named Emory Ballard. And I stumbled across his biography a couple of months ago, and he talked about there was no football team on the Port Aransas school. It was so small, and he took the ferry every day so we could go to Aransas Pass, which was just big enough to have a football team. And literally from there, he went to the top of the Texas high school football ranks, winning a state championship, and then head coach at Texas A&M and M and a couple of other major colleges. He was there in the 40s,
Uh-huh.
and so that word desolation was one, he didn't use that precise word, but he talked about it in the winter. But it really drove a sense of community among the people who lived on the island.
Absolutely. Really, I used that term. And when we were 17, 18 years old growing up there, it was kind of hard because we were like, what can we do? What are we going to? There's nothing happening. And we'd drive to Corpus or we'd drive over to Rances Pass. But I think now, if when I go down there, I miss that lack of activity. I miss the fact that it wasn't very crowded in the wintertime and the beach just was essentially deserted. You can still get that a little bit in deep winter where you can just drive down the beach for miles and get a really nice sort of feeling, almost a serenity you might get from just being on the Gulf like that, and it's just you and the water, or maybe you and your family. So that without the large numbers of people either down there partying out or just enjoying the beach. So it's something that now I view differently.
Could you maybe contrast that with a holiday? And I'm going to pick the fourth because that's my favorite holiday. That's really festive. A lot of people are happy, excited. They may be with family. They may be grilling, obviously having a beer or two. But to me, that feeling I would get over the 4th of July, really in any sort of holiday town or camp that I went to was unique. And could you maybe talk a little bit about that from your perspective?
So I have a little section in my book that talks to spring break. The 4th of July holiday was a very compressed sort of spring break. That the kind of crowds and activity and intensity were matched. It's just that they were obviously 4th of July is a shorter period of time there. But I had a different feeling about that when I was 16, 17 or younger than later on when I was going to college and in my 20s. I had gotten tired of that level of crowd because when you're waiting for an hour or an hour and a half in the ferry line, it's a frustrating experience. But so I actually have some of that in the book because that sort of party atmosphere that spring break has was certainly part of coming of age there. And we all participated in that. In fact, on my website, I have a few pictures from the late 70s spring break pictures, which are interesting.
I was really intrigued about your work in the following context: setting as character. And some books immediately come to my mind. They're the setting as a character. The fiction I've written is very action oriented. So the setting, I've never been able to achieve the level that I think you have. But could you talk a little bit about setting as character to you and how you're able to literally incorporate that into your books?
My very early influences when I first started enjoying reading novels and so on was Ernest Hemingway. He used place and he used it. He would write about real places, whether that was when he was in the army in World War One. He was a volunteer driving ambulances for the Italians there, but he talked about various villages and places in the Alps where they were conducting operations. And it was really fascinating to me. And then he also wrote a book called A Movable Feast. And that book really had a big influence on me, I think. I realized that I was just absolutely fascinated by his life as a young writer in Paris. Paris was giving him all kinds of opportunities to be a writer and actually live his life according to a rhythm and a pace that Paris delivers to people. And he was in an artistic community and so on. But I really enjoyed that he would name cafes that he went to and so on and so forth. So I decided maybe I fell into it by accident that writing a novel about growing up in Port Aransas, I should actually just talk about Port Aransas and not invent a fictional town, but talk about places that where things actually happened. Pelican's Wharf was a restaurant. I worked at Pelican's Wharf. I lived at Gulf Beach Cottages. I grew up there. So those and being able to talk about those places honestly and yet in a fictional way helps drive, I think, what happens with the characters and how they interact with each other. And it also makes them perhaps a little bit more believable and realistic.
I'd like to maybe go into your style of writing in the following context. I've written a lot of nonfiction, generally business related books, but when I turn to fiction, I almost feel like a reporter. The story plays out in my head and I just record it. And they say things I'm not expecting. They do things that I'm not expecting. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe he just did that.
Yeah.
But what is your process or your experience? Do you think about it and write it? Does it just appear? Do you do deep research and study, or do you drawing upon literally emotions and feelings for 20, 30, 40 years? All of the above, none of the above.
Let's see. So that's a great question. When I'm writing something, and when I wrote, and particularly with Under the Gulf Coast Sun, I found at times that I would start off with an idea that I wanted to maybe write about an anecdote or take something that happened and turn it into something that didn't, but still get that same kind of entertaining or educational sort of revelation from it, if you will. Sometimes things just come completely out of nowhere or I'll think of something and start writing it down, and I'll be heading in a certain direction, and it will just take a massive detour, and I'll wind up with something completely different. So that just depends on what stage of the writing you're at. If you're doing the rough draft, And I will say that when this book started out, it was first person. So it changed drastically because over the course of writing it, I decided I need this to be third person, omniscient. And so that was a big change as well. But I would say there's a general kind of trick that fiction writers have. They have to take what happened and turn it into something that didn't. And yet it has to have that same believability and sort of truthfulness to it that you might get reporting a story that happens as a journalist.
When I originally was doing some research on you and your book, and I read the title, Under the Gulf Coast Sun, I thought midday, blazing sun, oppressive heat, incredibly blue sky, the water lapping off of the seashore. And then I realized you're only thinking about that because it's 100 degrees in Kerrville, Texas. There's lots
Yeah.
of Gulf Coast suns. There's an evening sun, there's a dusk sun, there's a sunup sun. So I wanted to maybe explore with you, just using your title, Under the Gulf Coast Sun. Are you able to incorporate all of those phases of the sun into your story and maybe draw something from that?
That's a wonderful question. And I'm going to answer it with yes. So, the very first sentence of this book is a sunrise with thunderhead and a sort of a cloud pattern that you see on the cover of the book, actually. Other points, you have the characters on the beach. The sun is blazing just like you described it. It's extremely hot. It's humid. The wind is not really blowing very hard. And then there's also beautiful sunsets with rainstorms and rainbows happening. So all of these different phases of daylight, I guess, if you will, are there. And in certain cases, they're symbolic, and in other cases, they're just descriptive.
Yesterday or Tuesday, I interviewed a author who wrote a book about, it was wrapped around the 1900 hurricane in Galveston and the life of a medical intern. And so we went off on this rabbit trail of hurricanes that have hit the Texas Gulf Coast and how we all remember where we were, the year, the name, et cetera. And I was trying to think of a hurricane that would have either hit or been close to you. And the only one I could think of was, I think, August 79, a hurricane hit. I remember it hitting Corpus, so I have to assume you guys got it too. Were you able to incorporate something like that into the book as well?
First off, I think that's you're talking about Hurricane. I think Andrew was the name of
That's
it.
it. And
And I actually evacuated. We had to take our boat out of the water, and I had to drive a station wagon. My mom was too scared to drive, and the road was just fantastically crowded of everyone trying to escape this hurricane. I did not use a hurricane for the surfing parts of the story. There's a lot of surfing culture in this book, but I tracked down a an actual storm that wasn't quite a hurricane. It didn't quite make it to hurricane status, but I had remembered some surfing sessions that where the waves were just absolutely epic. They were perfectly beautiful, long lines, glassy smooth with feathered lips, offshore wind. And I tracked down this storm, just looking through the history of Texas storms, and so I used that. It was Tropical Storm Deborah, and I used that in the book. And I'm pretty sure that actually did correspond to some memories, specific memories I have of some surfing. And in this case, I threw the characters into that situation, the two main characters of the book, and gave them a chance to just to give the story a little bit more velocity at that point.
I try to interview as many Texas authors as I can. And one of the themes that I think I have uncovered, although maybe it was there all along, is how each of us are preserving a piece of Texas history and culture that we know. And I interviewed another woman, author from Galveston, who talked about the Latino experience in Galveston. We had a doctor talk about the medical experience during a hurricane. And I've had, excuse me, authors from North Texas talk about some of the dust storms and things like that. Is that something that we can use fiction for, to really preserve that cultural memory of what we know?
That was actually part of my intent when I wrote this book. There were a lot of stories and a lot of things I remembered about growing up there. And I wanted to be able to present those things in a way that was had a bigger story that it could be in. So, in other words, that I had to create a plot to put these memories into. While the memories aren't exactly things that happened, they are similar to things that happened in our experience every day. And I tried very hard to make the characters essentially be amalgamations of all the different people I knew, putting them together in ways that maybe express the more interesting parts of how people interacted with or behaved in that environment. A little fishing village on the Texas coast. It was starting to turn into a tourist destination. Many people love to go there. Port Aransas is beloved. And so I thought it would be really interesting to use that as a milieu to have characters interact with each other in a way that lets them develop their characters over the period of the story.
You've written a second novel, One Punk Summer.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you might contrast that book with Under the Gulf Coast Sun, and what were you looking to accomplish with your second book?
The actually Under the Gulf Coast Sun is the second one. The first one was One Punk Summer.
Ah,
I wrote it quite a long time ago. I wrote it after I had returned from Germany. I just translated a book of a now extremely famous German author, and I was interested in music. I played guitar. I wanted to write something that captured the Austin music scene. And this was before even South by Southwest had gotten started, and let alone the ACL Fest and all that that's turned into. So this story just concerned some kids getting out of high school and kind of trying to find their own way, rebelling against the lifestyles that their parents were leading, and just going out and trying to make something, make some art, in this case, music, punk music. And this other story basically is they put a band together and wind up playing at an extremely famous punk club in Austin called Raoul's, which is no longer there. And I used language in that to capture the state of mind of the characters and whatever they were doing. So if they were drinking a lot of beer and getting pretty schnockered, the language starts to try to represent that. And if they're very energetic and having fun and partying out or doing whatever they're doing, I tried to let the language express that. So it sort of has a prose poetry element. And I gave a copy to my publisher, Lauren, because I was teasing him that it is a book that defies rather than follows the Chicago Manual of Style. And we were joking around about that and how he feels guilty if he even makes any variation from that, which I understand. That's right. But he has a journalist background. But anyway, that was a very different approach than with Under the Gulf Coast Sun, which I did that much less with.
we're going to have to explore this a little bit
Okay.
because I landed in Austin in 1975.
There you
I
go.
have been to Roggles. And at that time, I thought the punk scene was more about lifestyle. Now, I'm a huge music guy, although I'm a listener and I'm not a player. And now I see punk as musically a reaction. I don't want to say to some excesses because I love prog rock, but as a response to maybe prog rock. And prog rock, a lot of strings, a lot of different rhythms, a lot of different timings. And when I heard punk, I thought, this is basic 4/4 rock and roll. Even I understand it.
Yeah.
And as a musician, how do you see punk? And really, was it a transitional phase which allowed us to maybe move back to some of the roots of 60s rock or pop that turned into rock?
I think that absolutely is. That's a great characterization of it. I learned how to play guitar when growing up in Port Aransas. I got a guitar, and a really wonderful Gibson SG guitar, and started playing that. And I would play heavy metal and progressive rock like Rush. Okay, I would learn how, and I played that for a long time. But later, I came to really appreciate what was happening in punk. A little bit belated, perhaps, but I came to really appreciate it as its own musical style, which is a reaction to some of the complexity that prog rock used as a basis for the music. So yeah, that's a great way to put it.
There were places on the drag where the musicians would just play for passing the hat. and a buck and a quarter pitchers kind of place. And
Those were the days.
I spent a lot of time in those places, but I got to listen to and talk to a lot of musicians because they'd have to walk around and pass the hat for their pay for that night, and really learned a lot about what they were trying to do musically. And I was just, like I said, seeing it as kind of a thumb in the parent's eye social movement.
Yeah. I enjoyed all of those wonderful places that Austin used to have that evolved over the 80s. And then many of these great places, Liberty Lunch, Rolls, obviously, Clubfoot, all these places, the Armadillo World Headquarters, those places got shut down. The town, as it started to change under the influence of the arrival of big tech, shut down a lot of those places. But the hole in the wall is still there. And you can still go there. And I don't think anyone pays for passing the hat, but usually people have tip jars out anyway.
I think I heard you say you work with Lauren Steffi for the publication of your second book.
Yeah, so this was another difference when I wrote Under the Gulf Coast Sun. I really was looking to have an editorial assessment of it done. I sent it off to a couple places. They sent it back. One of them kept it for 4 months, and I thought, oh, this is looking good. But while that was out at those publishers, I hired an editorial assessment editor who had written romance novels for Harlequin and their bestsellers. I wanted her feedback in particular because I have a very strong female lead character who I wanted to make sure that I had to get inside. Had to do some head hopping between the male main lead and this female. And I wanted to get a female's perspective on whether or not I was doing an okay job with that or not, or if there were problems. And also, I wanted to see what her feeling was about the overall structure and any kind of help that she could offer. She came back and told me she really liked it generally, but gave me some things to change. I made those changes and I sent those changes off to Lauren probably in January of 2024. Yeah, January of 24. And after a couple of weeks, he said, "Hey, please send me the rest of it." It was just, I sent him a couple chapters. And I was very surprised when he called me and said, "We really like this." And so that process for me worked very well, getting an editorial assessment. I did some other things to make sure that the plot and the story was driven according to certain kinds of beats that are important in love stories. But for me, I wanted to have a character, the female character, be an extremely strong person, and or at least very ambitious, very smart, and kind of a strong personality as well. And that was important for me. I also delved a little bit into, at the time, women were not going into engineering fields. They were not, generally speaking, involved with STEM type work. And I wanted this character to be driven to one day get to work at NASA. And that's what her father had done. And so she was very inspired by his career. There's all kinds of little things in the story where astronauts come over to their house and they're working through the physics of the burn trajectories and everything going out to the moon. But I wanted to have that. And it was really important to have that feedback, I think, for that character.
So could I ask you if you've got any projects in under work, got some ideas, or maybe share where you might go down the road with all this?
Sure, seems like I'm always coming up with some new idea and writing it down. I don't have time to do them all, but so I'm building an airplane. It's a kit plane, and when I'm done with that, I intend on flying it around, and I'm going to try to work on a book that talks about the experience of building the plane and flying it around, meeting other people who have also built airplanes and interviewing them. I don't know if you've ever read William Least Heat Moon's book, Blue Highways, but I have sort of something in mind along those lines. And I'm working on a novel right now that is a more literary fiction. It starts out on the Texas coast, but then moves to the hill country, following the character's development over time. Goes to Germany for a little bit and then comes back to the hill country where the story will play out in the hill country. It's sort of a love story, but it doesn't end necessarily with a happy end. I don't want to talk too much about it, but it leans pretty heavy into Greek mythology.
Now you've got me really intrigued because I'm a huge Greek mythology fan. But I hope that perhaps we can visit on that when it comes out as well.
Okay.
Skip, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more about your work, or certainly publish any of your work, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
I think that any online retailer will have Under the Gulf Coast Sun. The One Punk Summer is also available on Amazon, just like Under the Gulf Coast Sun is, but there are some select local bookstores down on the coast that have it. But I think the easiest way right now to get it would be just going to an online retailer and getting it that way, or going to Stony Creek Publishing's website. They have several different links to acquiring that book. It was certainly a lot of fun to write. And but those are the places. Yes, I also have social media. You can look me up on the internet and link into various websites. And certainly, I've got a couple of Facebook profiles. One of them is just Skip Rhudy, and one of them is Skip Rhudy Books. And you could go to either one of those. And I try to keep up with happenings that are related to writing and just normal everyday things that you might post on Facebook. So Skip Rhudy Books is more oriented towards the writing and the literature.
Skip, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure for sure.